is Starnago, and I chose to study the medieval medical understanding of epilepsy. I was interested in this topic because my roommate has a family history of epilepsy and it was on my mind. The sources I chose to analyze are the Breviary of Practice of Medicine by Arnau of Villanova, the Lily of Medicine by Bernard of Gordon, and the Doctor as Connoisseur of Pulses and Urines, which is uncredited, as well as a secondary source by Leo Connor titled The Names of the Falling Sickness, an Introduction to the Study of the Folklore and Cultural History of Epilepsy. The article by Leo Connor goes into a good amount of the history and the folk understanding of epilepsy prior to the medieval period. So in a lot of cultures, particularly like the ancient Greek culture, spirit possession was thought to be the main cause of epilepsy, and as well as possession by gods, and which gods were suspected to be behind it could be determined based on the different specific symptoms that were connected to that specific seizure. And this kind of possession was thought to be contagious, so people would spit at people having seizures as a form of protection, similar to the way people would protect themselves against the evil eye. This was debunked by Hippocrates in his text, The Sacred Disease. But across cultures, this was a common association that was had. There was also, for as much as it was feared and sort of looked down on, there was also a connection in some cultures between epilepsy and divinity. It was seen that seizures were moments where people would be more in divine harmony and sort of in communion with gods in the way that non-epileptics could not be. And it was also often called the falling sickness or various forms of that. And so there was sort of two polar opposite understandings of epilepsy, either a connection to divinity and sort of like a magical kind of power, or a strong abhorrence and fear to the point where some European cultures didn't even directly name the disease for fear of kind of inviting that disease. In the text by Arnau of Villanova, who was a physician that lived in the late 13th century, from the book The Breviary of the Practice of Medicine, there is a chapter on epilepsy. In it, he identifies true epilepsy as coming from phlegm and false epilepsy as coming from melancholy mixed with phlegm. He then further specifies that there are 3 different kinds of epilepsy according to where the epilepsy comes from. The first one is from when the matter causing the seizure is directly in the brain, and the signs of this kind of seizure are that the quote, the victims suddenly fall, emit a great foam, and do not speak. This would be pretty similar to how a grand mal seizure would be described now. And the second kind is called anepilepsy. This is said to come from the matter causing the seizure to be in the arteries or the veins or the stomach, which, quote, boils over and is snatched up to the brain. Sometimes vomiting is a symptom that accompanies this kind of seizure. And then the third kind, called cataplexy, is when the matter that causes the seizure is in the extremities, such as the hands or feet. Arnau references Galen here, supporting his treatment to prevent this kind of disease by physically binding the extremity that is thought to cause the seizure, to prevent it from moving up through the body towards the brain. This sort of conceptualization of the source of unwellness moving throughout the body reminds me of how the uterus moving throughout the body was thought of as a source of a lot of women's ailments. Arnau then goes on to note that, quote, when this disease occurs between infancy and puberty in males or infancy and the first menstruation in females, it can be cured. After that, only rarely and with the greatest difficulty will it be cured. So this is a recognition that epilepsy tends to be more benign in childhood and becomes more and more likely to cause lasting damage in adulthood. And this is an observation that we still find true today. The second primary source, a section from The Lily of Medicine by Bernard of Gordon, also from the same time period as Arnau of Villanova. He states that the cause of this disease is a coarse windiness occluding the non-principal ventricles of the brain, impeding the passage of breath to the members, and therefore the patient is driven to fall suddenly to the ground. He also notes that this kind of occlusion comes from the phlegm most often, and then next most likely it can come from melancholy, then from blood, although very rarely from blood alone, and almost never from choler or yellow bile. Both Bernard and Arnau note that there's often foam in the mouth. Bernard then further goes on to specify that epilepsy is a spasm and is accompanied by a spasm ailing the whole body. He describes that the nerves are shortened and drawn towards their source in an attempt to expel what is injuring them. So I'm guessing that this connects to what Arnau of Villanova talked about as like the different sources of the matter causing the seizure. But Bernard of Gordon goes on to say that sometimes the matter itself and the spasm trying to get rid of it is small enough or subtle enough that the spasm is not physically evident, and this is thought to be as one of the first distinctions between a grand mal and petit mal seizure. An area concerning this disease that Bernard goes into that Arnau did not really go into was the effect of diet and lifestyle. He says everything which quickly and suddenly heats the head, such as a long stay in the sun, or bath, or excessive coldness, or abundance of food and drink, drunkenness, abundance of smoky food such as garlic, onions, and the like, and in all cases a poor regimen, could be causes of epilepsy. While these are not super specific criteria, the observation that diet and lifestyle have an effect on epilepsy is something that is still agreed upon today, and one option for treating epilepsy that is still recommended today is switching to a ketogenic diet. In the context of treatment, looking at both of the documents so far, it's interesting to note that neither of them offer much in terms of direct treatment of epilepsy, which makes sense, as even now the options for treating epilepsy either are anti-epileptic drugs, surgery to remove part of the brain causing seizures, or the insertion of a small electrical device to help regulate seizures, or the ketogenic diet, which isn't a lot of options, and they require pretty intensive medical procedures, so it makes sense that in the medieval period their treatment options for this disease were pretty limited, and that probably contributed to its sort of highly contentious, kind of mysterious place in people's understanding, where they were either super mystified by it or super afraid of it. Looking at the third source, which is much shorter than the other two, the section about the pulse of epileptics in The Doctor as Connoisseur of Pulses and Urines, it states that the pulse of epileptics who are not in spasm is huge, and by its leap extends the motion of the arteries to the maximum degree of length. As an aside, I find the practice in medieval European medicine to take the pulse and to feel its differences as very similar to what I learned about the practice of pulse taking in medieval Chinese history. In this course I took last spring. And in that tradition, it was more seen as a method of measuring and feeling the qi inside a body, which was a sort of form of energy separate from blood that was thought to be running throughout the entire body. Another similarity between medieval Chinese medicine and medieval European medicine that I've noticed is, in contrast to the modern biomedical approach, there is a similar shared emphasis on taking in factors that seem much more holistic compared to what we do today, factors such as diet, lifestyle, temperament, geographical location, season, etc., when it comes to diagnosing and picking a treatment path. Connecting to this more holistic and open approach to what causes could be responsible for a disease, the Connor article referenced that according to one of St. Hildegard of Bingen's text, sometimes one incurred epilepsy when the moon was in eclipse. In general, there were not a lot of treatment options, which made the disease more scary, and although the medieval medical understanding had explanations of epilepsy which fit into their logic, the lack of knowledge about treatment for it explains why many cultures feared epilepsy in a way that is different to most other illnesses. Not to mention that watching someone seize is a very jarring and scary thing to see, especially if it's your first time and you don't really know what it is. It makes sense that a lot of folk understandings of epilepsy leaned heavily towards blaming spirit possession, even through the medieval period, as Connor writes about. Even if there was a medieval logic reason for epilepsy, belief in spiritual possession as a cause for maladies was still very prevalent in the medieval period in general, for other forms of ailments and sufferings, especially if they didn't respond well to medical treatment. And turning to spiritual or religious sources for treatment in those cases was considered normal and wise. Looking more at epilepsy in the medieval understanding was a case study in the intersections of medical/physical understandings and faith, between the physician's understandings and folk understanding, occupying a space that was both very feared and misunderstood.